I do just want to start with acknowledging, celebrating the traditional owners on whose lands we're meeting various places around the world. We're here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here in Canberra, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present. So I'm Sharon Friel. Welcome to Saving the World webinar series. We're here in a very cold Canberra. We've just been complaining about how cold and dry it is. I hope it's a little bit warmer wherever you are. So the webinar series comes to you from the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, which is part of a ARC Laureate Fellowship initiative focused on governance for planetary health equity based here at the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance. And I'm joined today by Dr. Nick Frank. Nick's one of the Laureate Research Fellows, and each month, as you know, if you've been listening to the webinar series, each month we're joined by a speaker discussing various aspects of the consumptogenic system, the structures, the processes, the institutions, the different origins of this consumptogenic system, and what all of that means for this intersecting challenge of climate change, inequality, and poor health. And I'm really delighted today we're joined by Professor Susan Park. Susan's Professor of Global Governance at the University of Sydney, who does just incredible work across a range of issues. And today, Susan's going to be speaking about ecojustice, and we'll be discussing, Nick will discuss after Susan's remarks, sort of making that connection into planetary health. So with no further ado, Susan, so pleased to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be able to present to you today. I'm just going to share my screen with you. There we go, so you can see. Whoops.
Perfect.
I'll just move it up. Okay, so it's just an absolute delight to be here and to be able to talk to you all about the project that I'm doing on ecojustice. So in 2019, we had 4 environmental defenders that were being killed every week around the world for defending their livelihoods and the environment. That was a 30% increase over the previous year. Environmental conflicts are on the rise globally as communities challenge accelerating environmental destruction from development projects, focusing on extraction, extensive land clearing, and energy generation. Contributing to climate change, to habitat loss, species extinction, rampant development is also facilitating the crossing of known ecological system boundaries globally, with likely catastrophic effects. As the UN has pointed out, international finance, public and private, multilateral and bilateral, must grapple with the consequences of its lending practices. So many people harmed by extraction, production and development projects often choose non-legal, non-binding international grievance mechanisms to have their voices heard. This is often because legal and political options may not be available to them. Indeed, around the world, people put themselves in grave harm from state and corporate reprisal for speaking out to protect themselves and their environment. International grievance mechanisms are increasingly used to provide recourse for people suffering environmental and social harm from internationally funded development projects. And approximately 41% of international development funding is channeled through institutions like the World Bank. Often these multilateral institutions provide development projects, they provide program loans, they provide technical assistance to their borrower member states, as well as political risk and equity investment in companies in developing states for international development. But of course, we know that development projects can have dramatic and irreversible environmental and social impacts. Loss of lives, livelihoods and land, breakdown of community cohesion, species extinction, habitat loss, and irreparable damage to local ecosystems. The World Bank's inspection panel is an international grievance mechanism, and it does provide recourse for harm resulting from international development projects. And it seeks to identify whether or not the harm was a result of the World Bank breaching its own environmental and social safeguards. Despite operating for nearly 30 years, nobody knows whether or not the World Bank's inspection panel or indeed any other international grievance mechanism can contribute to improving conditions in project areas. So this is a project that really tries to ascertain whether or not people are being heard and whether or not their grievances are being addressed. So given the flourishing of the use of international grievance mechanisms globally, we really want to know what people are seeking recourse for as a first step to understanding whether or not their grievances can indeed be addressed. And this is part of an ARC discovery project that I've just started. So what are international grievance mechanisms? I'll move some things around so you can see. This is a picture of the the World Bank Inspection Panel officers out in the field undertaking an investigation. So these are international mechanisms that are created by transnational or international actors that give affected or potentially affected people the right to seek recourse for the impacts of their activities, especially where they have no access to liability mechanisms. So this is really to give you a flavour of the actual spread of non-legal mechanisms for recourse for people that suffer environmental or social harm. Just to give you an idea of the proliferation, we've seen these types of grievance mechanisms in multi-stakeholder forums, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. You've got industry initiatives like the Fair Trade Association. We've got corporate style project level grievance mechanisms from Nike and Hewlett Packard, and of course the multilateral development banks. So I focus particularly on the MDBs because they're public institutions, so people pay tax dollars to their governments, and the governments are shareholders of the banks, so they're public institutions. And as a result of the creation of the independent accountability mechanisms or these grievance mechanisms, there's actually public registries. So we can actually access the data on people that are making claims to them. So that's to give you a sort of big flavour of the fact that there has been a dramatic spread in the types of grievance mechanisms that are operating at the transnational and the international level. So the grievance mechanisms ultimately, there's very little research. Like, we just don't know how effective they actually are. So if we look at the sort of transnational mechanisms that are existing, like the Fair Labour Association, the Fair Trade Association, and others, these types of grievance mechanisms tend to operate on behalf of affected people, and the literature showing that they have mixed results, particularly if they are private market-based accountability systems that are influenced by consumer preferences. So if you're looking at particular industry association type standards like RUGMARC, very much affected by consumer preferences rather than the impacts of the people in developing countries. And a UN review has highlighted the dearth of publicly available information on grievance mechanisms, particularly those established by corporations, with limited and primarily case study research that's been conducted predominantly by NGOs. And there's one study that has found that, in general, international grievance mechanisms are overly reliant on providing monetary compensation as a remedy for harm, while being unable to adequately address human rights concerns compared with judicial mechanisms. So there are judicial mechanisms operating at the international level, and they are proliferating in terms of arbitration style boards, but these are generally focused on human rights. And I want to suggest that we need to put people in place and recognise ecological harms as well as human rights harms. So if you are interested, I've just put my website down the bottom, because I do have a large database of the claims that go to the multilateral development banks. And by this, I mean the World Bank Group, the African, Asian, Inter-American Development Banks, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. You can actually follow through the claims, the publicly available claims from the very initial claim through to the outcome. So that's a database that I maintain as part of this ongoing research. But the actual focus for this project is to identify what people are making claims about. And I've got a picture there from protests in India against the Narmada Dam, because this was the catalytic moment that created the World Bank's inspection panel, that people actually had the right to seek recourse for harm as a result of being financed a development project, in this case, mega dam project, financed by the World Bank. And so these are citizen-driven grievance mechanisms. So people have to make a complaint that they are or may be affected in terms of their rights or their environment being affected. So citizen-driven in the sense that people make claims, and then the grievance mechanisms for the multilateral development banks then determine through an investigation whether or not the bank was at fault, or, and this has been a feature for the past 15 years or so, can seek a means of problem solving. So between the bank, the state executing agency, there may be a corporation involved, and the community coming together to identify whether or not harms can be ameliorated. So these are the types of grievance mechanisms. And what I wanted to get a better sense of is really what exactly people were seeking recourse for. And so in that sense, I turn to the environmental and ecological justice literatures to really identify how we can understand people's grievances. And so what I did was to collect the original claims that people made to the international grievance mechanisms of the multilateral development banks. So I thought the environmental and ecological justice literatures could shed a better light on how to understand people's grievances and whether or not this could lead to improvements at the project sites around the world, with the aim of mitigating the trend towards conflict. And the basis for doing so is really to look at whether or not the claims to the grievance mechanisms seek to rectify failures, failures to provide access to information, failures to provide participation in the process, failures to discuss the redistribution of risks and benefits that people suffer as a result of international development project, and the rectification of harm impinging on their capabilities to lead full lives. But again, I wanted to go beyond the environmental justice literature, which is very Western oriented in the fact that it doesn't locate people in place. And I think this is incredibly important for how we understand how people view their place in the world and their relationship to nature. And I think this is an attempt to recognise that, in actual fact, many places around the world have cosmologies and worldviews where they have a relationship to nature that is not based on Western-style contract of ownership. So in doing so, I sort of recognise that environmental justice does have useful components for understanding people's grievances. So if I take recognition as a primary concern, we know that harm can stem from misrecognition of communities in project areas. And despite decades of research and rhetoric on the need for participation by communities, international development financing remains predicated on the rights of sovereign states, while lenders like the multilateral development banks and the World Bank in particular tend to continue to have a culture of lending approval, which focuses on pushing loans out the door over environmental and social project quality. A failure to recognise the social needs and welfare of disadvantaged communities can lead to injustice, with projects designed and executed in ways that facilitate environmental and social harm. So knowledge of the impacts of international grievance mechanisms at project sites may facilitate further rules for remedy. that could lead to improving environmental and social evaluations. Participation is also an important component because, as the environmental justice literature acknowledges, a failure in participation can lead to communities suffering greater environmental risks. And this is borne out with claims to the grievance mechanisms over the MDBs, overwhelmingly citing a failure to be informed of international development projects taking place in their communities, let alone being consulted with or providing consent for the project. So failures in recognition and in participation can have severe ramifications for communities. And this can lead to a maldistribution of environmental risks and benefits, so leading to negative impacts on people's capabilities to lead full lives. The environmental justice literature recognises that disadvantaged communities are more often affected by environmental risks than others, and as a result may receive a less than just distribution of environmental and social risks. So this can become evident in myriad ways, including bearing the brunt of negative environmental effects from projects for the greater good. So this can include health and environmental effects of pollution, of being pushed off arable land and into ecologically fragile areas, or suffering from heightened social tensions in project areas like mines that experience an increase in transient workers with antisocial behaviours. So such a maldistribution of environmental and social risks can negatively impact on people's capabilities to lead full lives. And the affected capabilities include economic loss, such as a loss of livelihood or a reduction of people's ability to feed their families, religious and cultural impacts, including decimations of spiritual sites, and we know that from the claims being made, physical impacts, including abuse and intimidation, as well as suffering the immediate physical effects from toxic pollution, for example, and political and social loss from a loss of informal representation and social cohesion, because projects can divide communities. So what I am seeking to do, and this is very much a work in progress, so feedback is absolutely welcome, is to evaluate the negative impacts of projects on the protections, again, that are promoted by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, I mean, that's big enough in itself, but I couldn't help myself because I think it's fundamentally important if we recognise the intersection between mass globalisation. Let's forget that people are making an argument about deglobalisation at this point, but we're seeing absolutely no stop in terms of extraction, production, consumption. And as a result of this, we really do have to look at how even isolated single development projects are in fact part of a much broader trend, as I said, in contributing to mass environmental destruction and crossing ecological boundaries. So for this reason, I've brought in the ecological justice lens to really think not just about how these grievance mechanisms work for people, but how people are using these anthropocentric institutions to act on behalf of nature as well. And so people are using the international grievance mechanisms not only for justice for their own communities, but for ecosystems in terms of their right to exist, to repair and regenerate. So I was particularly interested in thinking through how, even though these are Western-centric institutions that were created as part of the multilateral development banks, how they might be used by people that don't use those frames. And so what I've tried to do in the project is really to examine the concept of ecological justice and how it can be used to understand claimants' grievances, given, as I said, that many communities have worldviews that don't separate people from place. And in fighting for environmental rights and the rights of nature, claimants do in fact signal that they are willing to use these international grievance mechanisms to advance both human and ecological needs. So I'm, in that sense, locating people within ecosystems as harmed at the forefront of the analysis of the grievance mechanisms, rather than as a byproduct for assessing multilateral development bank compliance or non-compliance with its own safeguard policies. And so this is a fundamental break from current conceptions that really hold firmly to the construction of accountability as devised by the multilateral development banks themselves and their powerful member states. So a lot of the literature on the mechanisms themselves really is situated within this sort of understanding of whether or not they're doing what they should be doing. So current research on the international grievance mechanisms looks at whether or not they hold the banks to account, but not actually whether or not they lead to improvements at the project site. And I'm very, very pleased to know that there are now non-government organisations like Accountability Council that are now moving on to this next step of trying to evaluate whether or not people are better off after making a claim to these grievance mechanisms. So I should state that the grievance mechanisms, if you make a claim, it can take years to play out. And in actual fact, it doesn't stop the project from being built while the grievance mechanism is investigating the claim. So locating claims made by people suffering harm resulting from a development project sits within these broader struggles for environmental and ecological justice. And this recognises that claims to the international grievance mechanisms reflect these broader and accelerating trends, such as lack of community information and participation regarding development project impacts and the imperative to address ecological destruction everywhere. So to give you a sense of what I've been doing is to look at the claims that I've started to code. So there are over, I think we're at now 1,200 claims that have been submitted to the multilateral development bank. So I've been really focusing on the World Bank, the private sector part of the World Bank group, the African, Asian, Inter-American development banks, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So these have public case registries. So you can just click on their website. You can see how many claims are being made against projects funded by these banks. So there's approximately 1,200 of those in existence. We log those ourselves and then put them on the database that's on my personal website. Now, I can code approximately 425 of those claims. And that's because these are the claims where people have felt confident enough to make it publicly available. So a vast majority of claims submitted to the MDB grievance mechanisms are actually confidential. Again, fear of reprisal from their own governments or from corporations is certainly a factor. So what I did with my team of coders is to code these original claims to the grievance mechanisms by looking at whether or not people have grievances around whether or not they are recognised, whether or not they are part of, as being part of, being impacted, of experiencing harm, of having rights, to their ability to how they are treated and acknowledged in the development process. I've coded the claims according to whether or not people felt that they were or were not involved in the process, that they had access to a process of remedy, whether or not they could participate in the actual project and in terms of the decisions. So that participation really comes down to, again, this question of whether or not they were provided with enough information about how the project was unfolding, and whether or not they were able to to ask questions and to get responses and to intervene in the process, to know what was happening in an ongoing, accessible and timely way, or whether or not they felt intimidated, whether or not they felt that they were being deceived, or whether or not there was a withholding of information. The distribution of risks and benefits was really around whether or not people identified that they were at risk as a result of the development project in their community, whether or not they identified loss that would result from that, either in terms of a loss of land, a loss of income, whether or not they felt that profits were flowing equally or fairly. So this was quite a big category, covering whether or not this distribution of risks or benefits was harming them compared with others. The harm affecting capabilities, this is another big category. So we did have sort of general comments about generally affecting overall capability of people to live full lives versus very, very specific claims made by people in the original claims about the economic impact of the development project. Again, speaking very specifically about the normal functioning, like how it impact on them economically, physically in terms of, again, intimidation, but also physical health, social, cultural, and religious impacts. So whether or not their traditional customs or religious practices or sites, events would be affected. So there are different ways in which people are can be identified in terms of harm. So we then looked and coded according to whether or not people identified a separate concern, independent of their relationship to nature in terms of dependence on it, in terms of concern for species and for ecosystems. So recognising, of course, that this is, again, another separation of the division between a Western-centric versus an alternative understanding of the relationship to nature. But I did want to identify whether or not people were separately identifying concern for species and acting on behalf of species in terms of submitting claims to the international grievance mechanisms. So just to give you an idea of where the project is at this point, because we will continue to code, this is across all of the banks. And I just wanted to identify that when we did the coding, it's not that each claim was, this one is a complaint about capabilities, this one's a complaint about the environment. That's not what we did. We just wanted to see the various types of claims that people were making across. So there could be 3 or 4 claims that people are making per complaint. So we just wanted to get a sense of the spread of concern that people were making across these 425 complaints. So overwhelmingly, people have grievances in relation to international development projects funded by the multilateral development banks around distribution. This is the big blue bar. So overwhelmingly, people are concerned about the distribution of environmental harms and risks in terms of what is happening within their community and to themselves. So that's the number is 350 concerns across these 425 complaints. So this graph is a bit of a concertina in the sense of, if we look to the left, you can see abuse, the number of times abuse is registered as part of a grievance against the multilateral development banks. Again, concertina in the sense of capabilities is the orange bar. That's quite, that's sort of in a general sense, people generally making claims about capabilities, and then much more specifically broken down into economic capabilities, physical capabilities, religious and cultural and social capabilities. What's interesting that comes out of the sort of coding, and perhaps this is not surprising if you're familiar with international development, is after the distribution concern, primarily people are, of course, worried about not being given the opportunity for informed consent and not being involved in participation. So this is the sort of mustardy colour bar is the second most important. The lack of participation in development projects that are necessarily impacting on them, followed by a discussion of how to provide informed consent in a timely manner in a way that is understood by the community. The sort of, not even sure if I'm colourblind, but the environment, which is this sort of muddish brown colour, does come up as people significantly identifying that they do want and are concerned about the impact of the development project on a specific species or local ecosystem. And so we find this, for example, just one of the claims was against the Condor gold mine in Nicaragua, where people were actually concerned about the impact on the rights of nature, where they identified specifically that the open pit mine would have severe environmental impacts on the fauna of the area and surrounding ecosystems. And they were very worried about the dry tropical forests and said that the ecosystem is one of the country's most threatened and that mining exploitation would cause the biological connectivity between the habitats of the ecosystem to be seriously affected. They identified that removing the vegetative cover would interrupt the flow of species between habitats, principally the birds and the small mammals who depend on the habitats for water and food. They thought that this would compromise the conservation of ecosystems of the area of the species that depend upon it. So this is to give you an idea of how people are using the grievance mechanisms for ecological justice as well as environmental justice. So just to give you a sort of wrap up, the grievance mechanisms are being used by communities for environmental as well as ecological justice. So it's coming up across all categories, primarily, as I said, around the distribution of environmental harms and risks and benefits, compared with, looking, for example, at other concerns. Obviously, the biggest issue for us is now to identify whether or not people are actually getting the redress and the remedy that they need in order to lead full lives in ecosystems that can regenerate and repair. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Lovely, thanks. It was marvellous, really. Yeah, so interesting. So before we open up for discussion with people who are online, I want to hand now to Nick. Nick's going to make a few remarks and then we'll open up. But yeah, marvellous, Susan. So many. I've got so many questions, but I'm over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Joan, thank you, Susan. I've got 1,000,001 questions as well, but I'll hold off on some of them. I do think that this question of whether environmental and social harm can be effectively addressed by international level mechanisms is a key one. And something you said in the presentation really struck me, which was that the harm caused by non-state actors is not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly a phenomenon that seems to be accelerating, despite all this talk about deglobalization. And then at the same time, you have this proliferation of IGMs and accountability mechanisms. And one thing that I was curious about was, well, it seems that international financial organizations and regional financial organizations like the World Bank, the ADB, the IADB face quite conflicted incentive structures. So on the one hand, they're financing these projects. And then on the other hand, they're attempting to manage the harms from those projects. And I can see how those incentives might not really align. How management, for example, and development banks would have incentives to kind of do away with claims that cause them some kind of publicity harm or political problems. So they do seem to be conflicted. And at the same time, there seem to be a way to at least partially give people some kind of recourse in terms of whether or not they're impacted by this kind of international level economic forces. And as you know, I think that the literature shows that IGMs are just not as effective as judicial mechanisms. So again, that said, you've got, I think, as markets become more tightly integrated, there is a greater need for these types of mechanisms to kind of contribute to international recourse. Given that the expansion in markets at the kind of global level and these international level forces have such profound effects at the local level. And IGM seemed to be a mechanism to provide at least a partial solution to kind of addressing that feedback loop. So at the Hothouse, we're particularly interested in questions of policy change, and it's something that I don't think your work really speaks to. And I would argue, as have a lot of other scholars, that development finance institutions make up a development finance regime complex. This kind of the system of non-hierarchical system of actors, semi-hierarchical system of actors. And I think it's reasonable to assume that states and policymakers, elites within that regime complex are subject to some kind of pressure to conform to certain norms. And, for example, recourse to people that have been affected by projects. That's certainly an argument I make in relation to the trade regime complex. I'm going to shamelessly plug a paper that's forthcoming in Global Governance. But within the development regime complex, what I was wondering was whether changes in organizational practices or behavior is a function of power. Is there a materialist explanation for it, or is it really based on how states and policymakers view something? Like, is there a normative or a constructivist explanation for change within the system? And what does that suggest about change? Is change an endogenous process that's about how actors are interacting with one another, or is it exogenous? Is it generated by things that are occurring outside this regime complex? So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I've got a ton of other questions, but I would love to hear your thoughts on change within the system.
Lovely. So Susan, shall we come back to you, and then we'll open up for colleagues online. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, me, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Fascinating comments. You're right. The multilateral development banks do sit within. They actually do have incentive structures for continuing to loan and continuing to lend. There's a significant amount of research on the fact that the banks don't build in project quality. This is a real and ongoing dilemma, I think. But also project quality in the sense of not just economic, but environmental and social quality. And I think, when the international community brokered the idea of sustainable development, you literally can have development and do it sustainably. The sustainability thing is always sort of the second consideration, not the primary. So the way in which the banks themselves are structured is to prioritize lending. And there's a fabulous comment from Michelle in the chat about whether or not you can prevent these types of projects from going ahead rather than actually just do the cleanup afterwards. As a result of a lot of the work on these grievance mechanisms and recourse, the United Nations has now weighed into this discussion with the UN Office of the High Commissioner releasing a report late last year. Called the Development Finance, Remedy in Development Finance. And what they've actually done is what we should have been doing for decades, which is actually how do you incorporate the right to remedy within the development process right from the get-go and build it throughout the development project process rather than waiting for accidents to happen. I don't want to overstate the problem. I mean, approximately 1% of projects financed by the multilateral development banks do end up going to a grievance claim. But these are usually real red flag projects that people have known about, projects that consistently fail, projects where there have been multiple attempts by people to identify that harm is occurring. And so the the intervention by the UN has been really welcomed from my perspective, because you end up with these massive problems in the types of grievance claims that come through. So, you know, we're talking about, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of people being affected by a development project, generations that are affected by development projects, being pushed off their lands, being disconnected from their ancestral sites. These are the types of things that you think could be averted and should be averted. Have we the time and the consideration to do so? So I really like, Nick, the question about whether or not there is a material explanation versus an ideational explanation for change. The ideational explanation is the fact that there have been consistent efforts on behalf of activists and communities over decades to actually get these grievance mechanisms to do something. So when I pointed to the picture from the Narmada Dam protest movement, that was the very basis for the creation of the World Bank Inspection Panel in 1994, and that flowed through to activists pressuring the United States to advocate for that. And the United States, so this is in a book I just published last year with Oxford, called the Good Hegemon, where the US was actually really instrumental in pushing for all of the multilateral development banks to have grievance mechanisms. And so that was both a material and an ideational argument, in the sense that the US thought it was a good idea, and so therefore withheld financing until the MDBs agreed to do that. Now, what's really interesting is the way in which the mechanisms themselves have improved over time. So originally they would just investigate the harm to the banks, like, did the banks contribute to the harm, yes or no? Is the bank at fault? Whereas communities were really pushing for mechanisms that would actually help them solve the problem. And that really kicked off with the Asian Development Bank, when, you know, the Asian Development Bank refused to recognise claims coming to its mechanism because they didn't want to be investigated. And so when the US again threatened to withhold financing, they actually went on a listening tour around the region. It's pretty unusual for the Asian Development Bank at the time. And communities said, look, we don't want a judicial style investigation that determines whether or not the bank is bad. What we want is to sit down and figure out whether or not we can address these issues. And that helped create a new norm, if you like, of what they call problem solving. So it's not proper style mediation, but it is an attempt on behalf of the multilateral development banks to see whether or not the harm can be rectified in real time. So there are both material and ideational elements to the evolution of the grievance mechanisms.
Well, I might open up, Susan. Is that okay? If we, yes. So colleagues that are online, we might, Josh, if you wouldn't mind, if everybody can see everybody.